All right, so let's dive into this whole Robert Pattinson thing.
Okay.
Seems like a lot of you are interested in, like how he's been trying to make his own way, even with, Twilight still hanging around. I
Okay.
mean, he even said, quote, "Are you still stuck on that shit? How can you be sad about something that happened almost 20 years ago?" It's crazy, right? He said that in a recent interview.
Yeah, it is
Mm.
interesting how Twilight keeps coming up even as his, filmography is going in such different directions.
I think what gets me is that Twilight, whether you love it or hate it, it was
Yeah.
this massive thing. We're talking a $3 billion box office giant,
Hmm.
and Pattinson almost seems to be like, I don't know, wrestling with it.
Yeah, that kind of reaction, it's not unusual, for actors who kind of break out in projects that have like really strong reactions one way or another. Like think about the Twilight fans, but then, all the critics and the internet making fun of it.
Hmm.
It's like two opposite ends. And trying to deal with that kind of attention, it can be tricky.
Yeah, makes you wonder if some of that started, back when they were filming. I read that Pattinson wanted to play Edward as more of an artsy vampire, which wasn't really what the studio wanted.
Right. Well, that's a classic example of the you have the artist's ideas and then you have what the studio wants, from a business side. I mean, they put millions into these things, so they want to make sure, lots of people will see it.
So maybe a like brooding, thinking vampire wasn't like their marketing plan.
Right.
Mhm.
Pattinson even called it emo Edward, and they like the studio, they were terrified apparently. They kept telling him to smile more, and there were even times they said they'd fire him.
Whoa, can you imagine being fired from a project like that? But I mean, you can see even then that he was already kind of, wanting to do something different.
Exactly. He seemed to be trying to find a depth, I guess, that wasn't really in the books or whatever. And it's interesting how it kind of leads to the choices he makes later.
So how did he, get away from that teen heartthrob thing after Twilight ended?
He basically decided to focus on independent films and art house cinema.
Art house cinema. What does that even mean?
Well, it's films that are more about like artistic expression and experimenting with storytelling, not so much about, being popular. Usually they're made outside the big studios, and they tend to look at, more complex themes and tell stories in unusual ways, like think David Lynch or Lars von Trier.
Okay, I get it. So what's an example of Pattinson doing the art house thing?
Well, in 2012, he was in Cosmopolis, directed by David Cronenberg, who's known for his movies are, pretty psychological, often a little disturbing, really different from the whole romantic fantasy thing.
Oh yeah, I remember reading about that. It was like totally different. Seems like he was really trying to choose parts that were, unexpected, like he wanted to get rid of the whole Twilight thing.
Cosmopolis was a big change. Critics who maybe, hadn't paid attention to him before started
I'd
to.
say.
But it was good time in 2017 that really changed things.
What was it about that performance that got everyone like buzzing?
Critics loved like how raw and intense he was, and they said he brought real depth to the character. It was physically really demanding too, and he totally became this guy who's like desperate and in the criminal world.
It's almost like he was using those indie films to show he could do a lot of different stuff and that,
Yeah.
there was more to him than just being good looking.
Yeah, exactly. He was choosing projects that, challenged him as an actor and let him show a range that, you didn't get in Twilight. And then 2019, there's The Lighthouse with Willem Dafoe, a psychological horror movie, black and white, very kind of a closed-in atmosphere.
Hard to get further from Twilight than that, right?
Yeah.
What do you think about that choice?
It showed he was really serious about those challenging roles, working with, these auteurs, choosing films that were more about artistic exploration than making money.
So it seems like he was pushing himself out of his comfort zone, both with the types of movies and the characters. He was on a mission to, like, change how people saw him.
Absolutely. And that, that wanting to do something different, it eventually took him to a very interesting place in his career with The Batman in 2022.
That's a great point. The Batman was huge, but his Batman was, I mean, not what anyone expected. He brought this darkness to it and like a depth that I don't think anyone was ready for.
Exactly. It was a big, mainstream movie, but he still managed to surprise people.
Yeah.
And it was both, successful and critics liked it.
It feels like the Batman was like a moment where he proved himself. Like he finally showed everyone he could do a big franchise movie and still do it his own way.
Yeah, I think so. It shut up a lot of the people who still thought he was just, a Twilight thing. And it opened up some interesting possibilities for him, like Mickey 17.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about that. That's the sci-fi movie with Bong Joon-ho, right? the guy who did Parasite. Seems like a huge step.
It is. He's playing like a clone who's used for space exploration, and the film itself is supposed to be, pretty mind-bending. It really shows, how much he wants to work with these directors who have like a vision and are changing cinema.
It's wild that even with all this success he's had, critically and at the box office, the Twilight thing is still there. It's like it's become this, unavoidable part of his story.
Yeah, and he's talked about how frustrating that is. Makes you wonder why this one role out of all the things he's done keeps coming up. Is it just how big Twilight was? Or is there something more?
Maybe it's because Twilight itself has like taken on a life of its own. It's become this thing that people are finding again, like through memes and TikToks.
That's an interesting thought. It shows how powerful pop culture is and how it can, change and still mean something to different generations.
Yeah, I was even looking at some of those memes the other day, and some of them are really funny.
Hmm.
Like there's one where
Yeah, it seems like no matter what he does, Twilight just won't go away. It's become this thing that people keep looking at and thinking about in new ways.
it's like he's trying to get away from the sparkly vampire, but it just keeps, following him. So, okay, I was looking at this meme, and it's Edward, sparkling in the sun. And the caption is like, me trying to avoid my responsibilities.
Uh-huh, that's great. It's amazing how, like, Twilight's become this funny thing, especially for, younger people who see it differently.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder if all this, like, ironic love for Twilight actually helps him. Maybe it keeps people talking about him even when he's doing those, more artsy movies.
There's definitely a chance that, people talking about Twilight keeps his name out there. It's like a built-in audience, even if they're not, necessarily the same people going to see his other films.
But even with the whole Twilight thing, he's built a really interesting career. It's not just the movies he chooses, but also the directors he works with. He seems to like, there's auteurs like Cronenberg and now Bong Joon-ho. What do you think draws him to those kinds of filmmakers?
Well, it seems like he's looking for directors who have like a strong vision, people who are known for doing something different with storytelling. Maybe he wants people who can, push him and help him explore, what he can do as an actor.
It's like he doesn't just want to act. He wants to be part of something that's, really new and makes you think.
Remember when we talked about Good Time and how critics were like blown away by him in it? Well, that was directed by the Safdie brothers, who are known for like their style is very gritty, very energetic. It's another example of Pattinson working with directors who have a unique voice.
And that brings us back to Bong Joon-ho. This collaboration feels like a big deal for Pattinson. I mean, Bong Joon-ho is amazing at like mixing genres, and his movies always have something to say about, society.
What's really interesting about Mickey 17 is that it's about identity and, being used and what it means to be human, all within this like sci-fi story about clones in space. It's pretty deep stuff.
Yeah, I remember reading that Pattinson was really into Bong Joon-ho's directing style, how it's, idiosyncratic, he called it. He's not afraid to try new things and seems to like working with directors who challenge, how movies are usually made.
It suggests he's not really interested in just being, a Hollywood star. He's not going after the typical big roles. He wants projects that let him, really use his skills and work with directors who have something, different to say.
And that's what makes him so interesting to watch, right?
Yeah.
He's not afraid to be different. He's not afraid to, maybe not succeed. He's not afraid to surprise people. It's like he's always changing and pushing himself. And that makes it, you never know what he'll do next.
Yeah, it's great to see an actor who doesn't want to be put in a box. I mean, he could have just, used the Twilight fame and done more of the same, but he decided to do his own thing.
It's almost like Twilight, in a weird way, made him want to break free from what people expected. It's like he's saying, hey, I did that. It was huge, but that doesn't mean that's all I am.
Maybe it gave him, the chance and the freedom to do the things he really wanted, even if they weren't, gonna make a ton of money.
And maybe that's the key, right? He's not going after fame or, being rich. He's looking for something, artistically fulfilling. And you could see that, that realness in his performances.
It reminds us that being a true artist often comes from, being passionate and wanting to do things differently. And Pattinson seems to have that.
Makes you wonder, what makes an artist like him make the choices he does? Is it working with these amazing directors? Is it always wanting to challenge himself and try new things?
Or maybe it's something deeper, like a need to redefine himself and get away from the things people expect from him.
These are good things to think about as we keep looking at his career and, how his choices affect both, like movies and, just culture in general.
It's a journey that shows us a lot about how artists change and, what it means to go against expectations.
So it's funny, right? We've talked about him, wanting those tough roles, working with these awesome directors, but there's still that whole Twilight thing.
Yeah, it's weird. He's worked so hard to move on, and yet it's still a big part of his story. Probably why you're interested in him too, right?
True. But does it help or hurt him, overall?
Well, being globally famous definitely helps, no question. Twilight made him like super recognizable, which opens doors, gets him opportunities, and makes him, really marketable. But it also puts pressure on him to like constantly show he's more than just Edward Cullen.
Right, like he has to work harder to be taken seriously. Do you think that's why he likes those darker, more complicated roles? That kind of break away from the whole, heartthrob image?
It's possible. He said he wants to surprise people, not be stuck doing the same thing. Picking roles that are totally different from Edward Cullen, that's one way to do that.
And it's not just the roles, it's how he does them. He
Yeah.
seems to really, like, become the character. Like in The Lighthouse, totally different, that beard, the accent.
He's not afraid to like really get into it physically and, emotionally, and people notice that, both critics and audiences. It shows he really cares about acting.
And he could be funny, too. Remember that quote where he said he'd be the first one to do a Twilight reboot if they paid him enough?
Haha, yeah. It's cool that he can, laugh at himself. It shows he doesn't take it all too seriously, even with all the fame and having to deal with a role he's obviously trying to move past.
Like, he knows it's there, but he's not letting it, stop him. He's using it, like, as part of his journey. But about Twilight, it's kind of crazy how it's changed. It went from this huge, like, cultural thing to, like, memes and people liking it in an ironic way.
It's like people are looking at it again and seeing it differently. And it's interesting how, like, younger people who weren't even born when it came out, they're, finding it in this new way.
It come full circle.
Yeah.
Critics didn't like it at first, but now, I don't know, maybe they're seeing it again for, like, it's kind of funny and it makes people feel nostalgic.
And that, that it's still popular, even if it's in a joking way. It shows how much of an impact it had and still has. It's become part of like how we talk about things, whether Pattinson likes it or not.
So what do you think? Will Twilight always be part of his story? And will it affect, what he does next?
Who knows? But I think it's safe to say he's made his own mark in the movie world. He's shown he's more than just, a pretty vampire. He's talented, he can play lots of different roles, and he wants to push himself and, see what he can do as an actor.
And he's chosen to work with some really interesting directors, like Cronenberg, the Safdie brothers, and now Bong Joon-ho. They're all known for having their own style and, being willing to take chances.
And that tells us a lot about what Pattinson wants as an artist. He's not afraid to try new things. He's not okay with just playing it safe. He wants to be part of something that matters, something that challenges both him and the audience.
So what about you listening? What do you think about Robert Pattinson's journey? Has he escaped Twilight? Or will that sparkly vampire always be there?
What do you think working with these amazing directors says about what he wants to achieve as an artist? And what does his wanting to do things differently tell us about how fame and being an artist are changing today?
Lots to think about, right? He's definitely an actor who keeps us guessing, keeps us interested, and keeps us, wondering what he'll do next.
He reminds us that being a true artist is about exploring, changing, and, never stopping that search for, like, creative fulfillment. And that's something worth, appreciating. This has been a really interesting look at Robert Pattinson's career. We hope you've enjoyed it.